So I want to first thank Rainer Funk for having invited me to this conference. It's an honor. Just a few preliminary remarks. Much of what I'm going to say is a summary of work I've been doing over now more than a decade. And much of what I'm going to say is going to sound ex cathedra. So if you really want the documentation and the evidence, you have to read the article, because I'm just going to mention some basic references. So for those of you who want the article, you have my email. I'll give you the email at the end of the talk, and I'll be glad to send it to you. So I'm going to read the introduction to this paper, and then I'm going to try to summarize it through PowerPoints, and I'm very interested in also showing videotapes that show how prosocial motivations show up very early in development before the full impact of culture is expressed in very young children by the age of 1 or 2, before the age of 1 or 2. So, except for Freud, no other psychoanalyst made an explicit, concerted, and systematic effort to grapple with the human condition as Erich Fromm. Fromm called his view of the human condition his concept or model of man, to get away from static and ahistoric concepts of human nature used to justify power and privilege of the few over the many. Fromm saw human nature as being fluid and dynamic and always in the making, but also thought that some conditions are inherent to the human nature and universal. He conceived the fluid and changing conditions as historical in nature, and the inherent conditions as existential to the human condition. He first articulated this view in Man for Himself in 1947, and later in slightly different forms in many of his other books. I will revisit here Fromm's view of the human condition and propose a different interpretation of the biological origins of the human condition. Fromm believed that the human nature came about by the combined effect of the relative loss of instinctual equipment and the dramatic enlargement of the neocortex. Based on recent evolutionary and developmental literature, I propose that human evolution was driven by the need to cooperate in ways that far surpass what is observed among our close ape relatives, the great apes. The great apes are the family of primates in which humans, bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. This is the family of great apes that we belong to. We're very closely related to the chimpanzees and the bonobos, almost 98.5% of genes we share with them. So we're very closely related to these cousins. So I will argue that our instinctual equipment was not lost, as Fromm believed, but was gradually transformed to support the cooperative infrastructure of our species. Over the expanse of almost 50 years, Fromm's view of the human condition was a unifying theme of his book. I think, Rainer, you mentioned this, that bothered us about Friedman's book, that it sounds like there were many Fromms, and his view of the human condition was one of those unifying themes. Fromm integrated a humanistic outlook with a very bold biological speculation that he first expressed, I mentioned before, in Man for Himself, and I quote, "The first element that differentiates human from animal existence is a negative one, the relative absence in man of instinctive regulation in the process of adaptation to the surrounding world. The less complete and fixed the instinctual equipment, the more developed is the brain and therefore the ability to learn. The emergence of man can be defined as occurring at a point in the process of evolution where instinctive adaptation had reached a minimum. But he emerges with new qualities which differentiated him from the animals: his awareness of himself as a separate entity, the ability to remember past and to visualize and conceive and understand the world, his imagination, through which he reached far beyond the ranges of his senses. Man, said Fromm, is the most helpless of all animals, but this very biological weakness is the basis of his strength, the prime cause of his development and his specifically human qualities. And later on, he went on to say, in the same book, man is part of nature, subject to her physical laws and unable to change them, yet he transcends the rest of nature. He is set apart while being apart. He is homeless, yet changed to the home he shares with all creatures. Cast into the world at an accidental place and time, he is forced out of it, again accidentally. Being aware of himself, he realized his own powerlessness and the limitations of his existence. He visualized his own death. Never is he free from the dichotomy of his existence. He cannot rid himself in his mind, even if he should want to. He cannot rid himself of his body as long as he is alive, and his body makes him want to live. So that's view of Fromm's view of the human condition. And in the next slides, I'm going to use PowerPoints to discuss this alternative interpretation of the human condition that I'll be being put forward. So I want to start with what Fromm got right. Basically, the enormous expansion of the neocortex in primates. But Robin Dunbar, who's a primatologist and anthropologist at the University of Cambridge in the UK, has been the main proponent of that this expansion has to do very much with the fact that the brain is wired to be social. The key premise of the social brain hypothesis is that the ecological problems are solved during human evolution by becoming highly social animals. The neocortical expansion of the brain is highly correlated with group size, a measure of social complexity, and interestingly, with long-term sexual bonds. I'll talk about that later. Before I talk about the enormous cost of having this expensive piece of real estate, I just want to say something about this expansion of the brain. In order to look at how just big the brain is in relationship to other species, we have to look at the relationship of the brain to the body to get a relative. So the 1.0 corresponds to the size of the brain to the body of a cat, which is considered for purposes of comparison the prototypical mammal, the cat. So more than one, you have a brain larger than you would expect according to body size. Less than one, you'd have a brain smaller according to body size. So just to give you an idea of how huge our brain is in relationship to other species, we have this relative comparison between brain and body size is called the encephalization quotient, EQ. So humans have an EQ of 7.2. Our ape primates, the chimpanzees, who already have a huge brain, have an EQ of 2.2. So we have an enormous brain. Now, as I said, this is a very expensive piece of real estate. 30% of energy that we're using right now in this room goes to feed the brain. So even during exercise, the brain expends 8 to 10 times more energy than the muscles. So there's a huge amount of energy just to get to feed this very expensive organ, the brain. So there had to be very strong selective pressures to offset this huge cost. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more. What were these trade-offs? So a lot of this talk is what these trade-offs were all about. So just to make clear, since the concept of instinct sometimes throws people off, I'm not talking about instinct as we thought about it 30 or 40 years, as fixed action patterns that were not subject to environmental influences. In fact, that view of instinct has always been wrong, because social instincts in very social animals and primates have never been subject to fixed action. They've always been subject to environmental influences. So to define what I mean by social instincts, or if you want to use the modern language of motivational systems, I want to define that what are the primary social instincts that we share with the great apes, which is going to be my main comparison here between our close relatives. Well, attachment bonds, the infant seeking protection from others, and the complementary caregiving bond, the mother's protection of the infant. This is, of course, the work of John Bowlby. Sexual mating, of course. Dominance hierarchies. Now, this is an important point, this issue of dominance hierarchies. The main form of social organization in all primates and many mammals and even reptiles are social dominance. Now, what are dominance hierarchies? A high-ranking male or female basically has control or has preferential access, or exerts preferential access over food and mates. So that's not the only form of social organization in primates, but if you look at primates, everything else falls under that social hierarchy. Great apes never lose sight of who's on top and who's on bottom. Okay? So dominance hierarchies and affiliation to other members of the group. My thesis is going to be that all these social instincts were gradually transformed during human evolution in order to serve the cooperative nature of our species. So I'm going to tell a small story about how this cooperation took place during human evolution. This work based on the work of many primatologists and evolutionary thinkers, Michael Tomasello and DeBrail, who's talked about steps in the course of human evolution. And basically, I'm going to talk about steps. Here, I'm not so much interested in dates. I've put some arbitrary dates. The first step is an educated guess. Nobody really knows when this first step that I'm going to talk about really took place. This is an educated guess, somewhere between 2.5 million to 800 million years ago. But what I am interested in is what's the sequence. Even if these dates turn out to be wrong, it's important to establish how cooperation built gradually. So this step thing is just a heuristic. It's a useful way to tell a story. It's going to change as we know more about it, but I'm more interested in what were the sequence that led to very advanced forms of cooperation. So the first step I've called obligatory cooperation and emotional modernity, and I'll define that in just a second. This step is before cultural evolution really hits sometime some 500 million years ago. So the next step is the emergence of cultural evolution. And the third step, and this there's no controversy, but this date of when human settlements begin in the archaeological record. Turns out we thought it was 12,000 years ago. Now we know that there were human settlements going back 17,000 years ago. Okay, so let me talk about this first step. What do I mean by obligatory cooperation? What's usually meant by obligatory cooperation is what's usually been called the African savannah hypothesis. So the background to the African savannah hypothesis is climate change. Again, approximately 2.5 million years ago is the beginning of the ice ages. They go all the way to 12,000 years ago. There were 5 glaciations and many minor ones. The effect of these ice ages in Africa were periods of wet and dry weather. And some of the dry weather was so severe that it produced enormous droughts during long periods of time. The effect of these enormous droughts in Africa was that the rainforest and river ravine environments in which our Australopithecine ancestors had lived for 4 to 5 million years before started shrinking. So our hominin ancestors had no alternative but to venture into a completely different environment of the African savanna, where there were other predators that were much more skilled and stronger than we were. So the only way we could survive in this environment is if we hang together as a group, if we protected each other as a group, and we were able to scavenge and forest as a group. So that's what it means by obligatory or forced cooperation. Now, I mentioned dominant hierarchies. So the next piece of the story has to do with what we know about nomadic hunters and gatherers that have been studied by anthropologists in the last 80 to 100 years. In 4 continents, all over the world. So, as one would expect, there are important cultural differences between hunters, nomadic hunter-gatherers that have been studied, the few that are remaining all over the world. But remarkably, they have one thing in common, despite their many differences. They're fiercely egalitarian. They will not let any male or female become dominant or take advantage of the rest. So the person who has mostly talked about this is Christopher Boehm, who's an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist and primatologist. He was trained by Jane Goodall. So he has an extraordinary ability to merge these two fields. And his view is the way we got rid of bullies during human evolution was by having the small groups of hunter-gatherers reverse the dominance so that they didn't let any dominant male take control of it, mostly through shame, ostracism, and humiliation, is Boehm's thesis. Now, many people have criticized this and say, look, hunters and gatherers, we can't say that hunters-gatherers in the last 80 years or so are living fossils. They're not the same hunter-gatherers of the Pleistocene in the last 2 million years that are the really important period of human evolution that most people focus on. But the thesis, there's been a remarkable article that just came out by Erich, who's a primatologist with a bunch of researchers from all over the world, where they discovered a group of fossils remaining in a cave in South Africa that dates 40,000 years ago. And this is what's remarkable about this finding that was published in Science just a couple years ago, that all the tools and all the artifacts found in that cave are almost the same tools you find by the Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert that have been studied by anthropologists. So that means that at least we have now strong evidence of 40,000 years of cultural evolution where there's continuity. It's remarkable. If you see the tools of the hunter-gatherers, of the Kalaharis, and the tools found in this cave, there's exactly the same tools. So now we have some evidence. Okay, thank you. How am I doing here in time? Okay.
About 10 minutes.
Wasted?
Yes.
About 10 minutes.
Okay. Now, the other important person in human evolution that I've really paid attention is Sarah Hrdy and her cooperative breeding hypothesis. Basically, the idea Cooperative breeding is a form of adaptation found in many species of animals. 1/3 of primates are cooperative breeders. The idea is it takes a village to raise a child. Almost all mammals and primates, the mother is the exclusive caregiver of the infant. They're very possessive, probably because of the high rates of infanticide you find in primates. So they don't let anybody touch their infant during chimpanzee first 6 months. Well, cooperative breeding has emerged in other species, but we're the only species in which cooperative breeding exists among the great apes. We're the only great apes where. So the mothers let other infants, grandmothers, siblings, take care of the infants. Her thesis is this is the first step that made us emotionally modern. I like her concept of emotional modernity versus cognitive modernity that appears much later at the end of the Pleistocene with the caves and paintings and symbols and so forth and so on. But that's cognitive modernity. But emotional modernity is the desire to engage with others and to understand the minds of others. Why did this develop with cooperative breeding? Well, because if you have this rich environment where infants are interacting with many caregivers, we know through developmental research that when you have infants subject to interaction with many caregivers, it develops their ability to understand the minds of others, to understand their intentions, feelings, and so forth. So this is what she means by emotional modernity. And I really much like the concept because I think emotional modernity comes first and cognitive modernity, as we see in Cro-Magnon man and the caves in France 40,000 years ago, comes later with symbols and language. So there was a long period of over 2 million years where we're developing emotional skills to cooperate. And then that's the continuity in human evolution. The discontinuity is emergence of language and symbols and imagination, okay? So I very much like her concept, and I just wanted to... the other major sociobiological change that occurred during these 2 million years, nobody knows exactly when, was we're the only ape in which we developed social bonds that are more or less persistent between males and females while they're mating. Other apes mate promiscuously. They don't form a sexual bond. We've developed enduring sexual bonds. Now, this was very important for a number of reasons. Males started to recognize their infants as their own. So now there was social recognition. So they were less aggressive. And because of the rules of exogamy, which means that you don't mate with somebody within your own group, you mate with somebody else, males started to mate with the females of other groups. And once you have this bond between a male and a female bonding sexually between two groups of nomadic hunter-gatherers, you have cooperation among groups. Now, you don't find that cooperation anywhere else in the primate among the great apes. And this cooperation, and not just competition, was necessary for the evolution of culture and during human evolution. So, enough about step one. Step two, cultural evolution. Cultural evolution depends on several things. It depends on the ability for primates, for apes to be able to deliberately teach their infants. Great apes do not teach. They learn by imitation. We're the only ape in which parents actually teach skills to others. So now we have two modes of inheritance. We have inheritance based on DNA, and we have inheritance based on cumulative culture, cumulative knowledge from one generation to the next. These traits remain stable and they differentiate. So as long as you have stability in traits and differentiation of traits, you have natural selection. The great difference is that DNA changes occur. A major change takes 10,000 years to occur, whereas changes by inheritance through learning occurs within a generation. So it occurs at the speed of light. It's Lamarckian as opposed to Darwinian, if you will. now here's an important connection I want to make in terms of this conference. There's many evolutionary thinkers that think that a key point in culture evolution was the ability to develop shared social norms. Now, why was this? It gets back to one of the puzzles in human evolution. It's called the free rider problem. If you have a public good, like sharing food, like most hunter-gatherers do, they share food that they bring from hunting, big game, shared among the 30 or 40 members of the group, that's a public good. So how do you prevent free riders from taking advantage of that? Well, one way, you can punish them, okay? But if you punish them, they'll retaliate and you have a cycle of violence. Well, the other way you can solve the free rider problem is that you have social character that establishes norms of equality and fairness. That's what evolution calls shared social norms. They become internalized, and then you'll want to do what you have to do according to the social norms. So one of the great joys I have found in looking at this very vast literature is to realize how shared social norms is playing, and the importance of shared social norms is critical for understanding human evolution. Okay, so I'll just skip. And there's not only cooperation between, but also competition between groups. So selection now, the groups who were more cooperative together competed more favorably with less cooperative. So now selection is not only occurring at the level of individuals, it's also occurring at the level of groups. So step 3 has to do with permanent settlements. Now, once we have larger settlements, we can no longer govern informally through social norms and social reputation. Social reputations also play a very large role during human evolution. So, social institutions emerge to organize wars, policing, judicial, etc. The larger these enlargements come, we couldn't rely on formal ways of governing ourselves. We need social institutions. And with the social institutions, there's a recurrence of social hierarchies during human evolution, but now in the forms of institutions. So enough about the 3 steps. I'll just say very briefly about childhood. We have the most prolonged childhood of any known species. And many people think that the reason for this very prolonged childhood has to do with giving us time to assimilate the cultural knowledge and competency we need to be effective. But that also has a huge cost. So without cooperative breeding and without these mating systems, we would have never evolved, because it really does take a village to take care of an immature children and a big brain. So cooperative breeding was critical for human evolution. So I just want to show a few films about prosocial motivation. By prosocial motivation, I mean this social engagement that's there from the very beginning, norms of fairness, helping others, sharing with others. That's what I mean by prosocial motivations. So the first kind of social engagement we see in infants is in the form of proto-conversations. There's wonderful babbling between mothers and infants. You see at 2 months and more clearly at 4 months. And it's been studied by infant researchers. And I just want to show you an example of how this proto-conversations look like by 4 months of age. Oops. I didn't want to go back. Let's go here.
To talk and play with her daughter the way she normally does.
Sweetheart.
Obviously, their connection is strong.
There's my baby.
The baby is engaged, responsive, clearly emotionally content. Then, Dr. Tronick instructs the mother to disengage by making a still face. She stays there, but doesn't respond to her baby. Mackenzie is confused at first. She's not used to Mom acting like that. Mom turns back, but keeps the still face. Mackenzie expects her to re-engage, but when she doesn't, look how the baby reacts. Even at this young age, she tries to entice Mom to interact with her. She reaches out. She smiles. She flails her hands. All strategies for getting Mom's attention. When that doesn't work, she becomes fussy, emotionally agitated. And finally, she just gives up.
The meaning of the event is this emotion that the infant is experiencing in relationship to this breaking of the connection in relationship to the mother. And that's a fearful, frightening thing. And the infant will do a lot to try and overcome it. But when they fail with a sense of helplessness and a loss of control.
Dr. Tronick then asks Mom to re-engage. It takes a moment, but soon the world goes back to normal for Mackenzie. This striking dynamic happens not just with parents, but with any close caregiver.
Okay, now let's see the same phenomena in rhesus monkeys. And you'll see this thesis of the transformation of intersubjectivity from primates to humans. Now, mother's going to start to try to engage, establish eye contact with her infant. Kisses her, caresses her, tries to get her attention. There's eye contact there. You can't see it, but there's now beginning of eye contact. But it's hard to, as you can see, the mother works at establishing that eye contact and establishing this intersubjective engagement. Okay, that just basically makes my point. What's really remarkable about this intersubjective communication and eye contact with primates is that it develops during the first 1 or 2 months and then it disappears. Whereas in humans, this intersubjective development occurs throughout the lifespan. So there you have an example of enormous differences in terms of the transformation of the social engagement system. So now I want to show you that helping, how we're different in terms of helping others.
We have a minute or so to go here, so we're kind of running slightly over, just so you know.
Okay, I'll just show 1 or 2 films and I'll stop. Is that okay with you guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh. Oh.
Here's a 14-month-old. Hasn't been prompted. This is very spontaneous. Okay. There you go. Let me show you the same thing with primates. It's not there. Where are you? Okay. With primates, they can help, but not to the extent. Just take my word, not to the extent. I can't find that film right now. So now let me show you an example of cooperation. This is work by Michael Tomasel. He engages infants in all kinds of cooperative tasks with the experimenter, and this is just one of the many experiments he did. And I want to talk about this a little bit. So, this is another example of cooperation, of helping. This is not the one I wanted to show. There you go. So, okay, so you get the idea. I'm not going to want to show about the chimpanzees because I don't have time. I just want to show this one of cooperation, and I'll stop with this one. And I'll, in the discussion period, I'll talk about conclusions, okay? So let me see. Let me get this going here. So this double tube is the 14 or 16-month-old has to put this block and be received by this tube. So he's been trained to do this. Okay, this is the important part of the experiment. The experiment is told, okay, stop this play with this, and let's see what the infant does, the toddler does. He re-engages the... Now, here's one difference with the great apes. First of all, the great apes won't cooperate in these activities unless there's food involved. And second, is the experiment stops, the great ape, chimpanzees, just are not interested. So here you just see a major difference between the great apes and humans. So my time is up. I would have much more to say about all of this, but in 25 minutes it's hard to summarize what I've been working over for over a decade. So during the conclusions I'll talk about, during the discussion I'll go back to Fromm and my conclusions about this talk. Thank you.